Think your life is hard? Bad Wi-Fi, cold coffee, long workdays? Please, you wouldn't survive breakfast in the Middle Ages. We like to romanticize that era.
Knights in shining armor, feasts in candlelit halls, damsels spinning poetry by the fire. Reality check, it was grimy, gut-churning and often fatal. If you think you're tough, let's see how long you'd last in a world where your dinner could poison you, your toilet might attack you, and your doctor's best advice was, let's bleed you a bit. Let's dive into the dark buffet of medieval life, starting where all good stories begin. The dinner table. Forget what you've seen in movies, those overflowing banquet tables were reserved for kings and their tax collectors. The average villager's meal looked more like sadness in a bowl. Most people lived off something called pottage, basically a slow-cooked sludge made from oats, roots, and whatever the garden hadn't given up on yet. It simmered in the same pot for days, sometimes weeks, absorbing every flavor and every fly that fell in. Bread was the main staple, but don't picture that soft, golden loaf from your supermarket. This stuff was so dense you could use it as armor plating. And the flour, ground between stone wheels that shed grit into the mix. People literally wore down their teeth on their daily bread. Dental care wasn't even a concept, your molars were just collateral damage from lunch. And here, where it gets worse, medieval bread often contained a fungus called ergot. This lovely organism produces toxins that cause hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. Entire towns supposedly started seeing demons and witches because their rye crop went bad. Imagine tripping so hard you think your neighbor is flying on a broomstick, when really it's just your baker who needed a cleaner millstone. Meat was a luxury most couldn't afford. When peasants did get some, it was often halfway to decomposing. Without refrigeration, you ate what you had, and if it smelled off, you didn't throw it out. You covered it in spices and prayed your stomach could handle the gamble. Expiration date wasn't a thing. The medieval rule was, if it moves, cook it. If it doesn't, salt it until it cries for mercy. And you couldn't even wash it down safely with water. Streams and wells were basically liquid disease, filled with waste, dead animals and worse. So what did everyone drink? Beer, all day, every day. Not the strong kind, a light ale, weak enough for kids but still safer than water. Historians say even 5-year-olds drank several pints a day. Congratulations, you're in preschool and already on your third round. Fish helped fill the menu, especially on church fasting days, but inland towns had a problem. By the time the catch arrived, it was halfway to fossilized. Salting or drying kept it from rotting completely, but the taste. Let's just say it was an acquired trauma. So your options for dinner, a pot of vegetable sludge, a loaf that doubled as a dental weapon, and ale for hydration. Gourmet dining, medieval edition. But if the food didn't make you sick, the next part definitely would. Bathroom breaks in the Middle Ages were an adventure in horror. Most homes had a chamber pot, basically a bucket you kept under your bed. When it filled up, you tossed the contents into the street. Literally, right out the window. If you were feeling polite, you yelled Gardes Elo, French for watch out for the water, which actually meant incoming poop. City streets were rivers of filth, human waste, animal guts, spoiled food, and mud, all fermenting together into a smell so vile that travelers wrote poems about it. Romantic, right? If you were fancy enough to live in a castle, your toilet was a hole in a stone seat that dropped waste straight down the wall, sometimes 70 feet into a moat. Royal bathrooms weren't much better than peasant ones, they just had a better view. Public latrines existed, but they were few and far between, often perched over rivers. And since rivers were also where people got their drinking water, well, you can do the math. Then there were the heroes no one wanted to be, gong farmers. Their job was to climb into cesspits at night, shovel out the waste and haul it beyond the city walls. The stench was so powerful they weren't allowed to work during the day or mingle with the public. But they earned good money, about 4 times a regular laborer's wage, because apparently, civilization runs on someone willing to handle your literal crap. Toilet paper, nice dream. People used moss, leaves, or whatever was handy. The wealthy might get wool scraps. The poor used their left hand, which explains why shaking hands with your left was considered deeply offensive. So after your pottage dinner and your ale bath, you stumble out into streets lined with filth and wonder how anyone survived. Spoiler, most didn't for long. If you were born poor, and most people were, your job was to work until you dropped. Over 90% of medieval Europeans were peasants tied to farmland owned by nobles. You rose with the sun, spent the day ploughing with wooden tools and oxen, then collapsed at night in a hut with a dirt floor. During harvest, you could work 16 hours straight under the blazing sun. Historical estimates say a single farmhand burned over 4,000 calories a day, not from workouts, but just staying alive. Medieval peasants didn't need gyms. Survival was the ultimate cardio. Children didn't escape either. By age 7, many began apprenticeships in trades like blacksmithing, carpentry, or weaving. They lived with their masters, working 6 or 7 days a week, often for over a decade before earning a wage. Imagine being 7 and your boss already yelling at you for not hammering fast enough. Then there were the truly grim jobs: tanners soaking animal hides in vats of urine, blacksmiths inhaling smoke until their lungs gave out. And pure finders, people who collected dog droppings for use in leather production. If your job title included the word pure, it definitely wasn't. Wages were pitiful. A day's work might earn enough for 2 loaves of bread. Forget saving for retirement, the goal was to make it through the week. Work-life balance, it was all work, no life, and an early death. And if the job didn't kill you, disease probably would. Medieval medicine was less science and more guessing with knives. Germ theory didn't exist. Doctors believed illness came from bad air or an imbalance of bodily fluids, the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you got sick, the cure was often worse than the disease. Got a fever, they'd slice open a vein and let you bleed into a bowl. Feeling weak, more bleeding, still sick, leeches, sometimes dozens at once. A medical manual even recommended 70 leeches for certain ailments. Hospitals existed, but they were more like hospices, places you went to die surrounded by prayers, not medicine. Childhood was a coin toss. Nearly a third of children never made it past age 5. The average adult lifespan hovered around 35. A simple cold could spiral into death because nobody understood infection. The Black Death wiped out nearly half of Europe in the 14th century. Doctors wore those creepy bird masks filled with herbs to filter the air, but it did nothing. Meanwhile, treatments included rubbing onions on buboes or sitting next to a fire to sweat out the plague. Helpful advice if your goal is to die warmer. Dentistry was its own nightmare. No anesthetic, no sterilization, just a guy with iron pliers and strong arms. You didn't schedule appointments. You screamed loud enough and someone came running with tools. And when they weren't bleeding you, they were poisoning you. Mercury was a common remedy for infections. Side effects included, well, death. Medieval medicine didn't need disclaimers like consult your doctor. The doctor was the warning label. If you think the justice system today is flawed, medieval law makes it look like paradise. Laws changed from town to town. Something perfectly fine in one village could get you executed in the next. There were no rights, no lawyers, no due process. The presumption was guilt until proven dead. Minor theft, lose a hand. Speak against the king, lose your head. At one point, more than 200 crimes in England carried the death penalty, including stealing anything worth more than 12 pence. And then came the trial by ordeal. The logic was simple: if you were innocent, God would save you. One test involved carrying a red-hot iron for several paces. If your burns healed quickly, divine approval. If they festered, shocker, you were guilty. Another favourite was the swimming test: tie the accused and throw them in a river. If they sank, innocent; if they floated, guilty and executed. Basically, every path led to drowning. Executions were public spectacles. Hangings, beheadings, burnings, even disembowelment for treason. The crowds brought food and children. It was entertainment. Netflix didn't exist, so watching someone lose a limb was the next best thing. The rich had loopholes, of course. Nobles could demand trial by combat, hiring professionals to fight on their behalf. If their champion won, divine justice supposedly cleared their name. Convenient system if you can afford a knight with muscles. Prisons weren't punishments, they were waiting rooms for torture or death. Dungeons were dark, airless pits where prisoners were chained to walls and fed only if family members brought food. Torture devices like the rack, thumbscrews, and iron maidens were used to encourage confessions. And once you confessed, even under agony, your fate was sealed anyway. Public humiliation was a lighter sentence. The stocks, where people threw garbage and insults at you, or the ducking stool, used mostly on women accused of gossiping, who were repeatedly dunked underwater. Medieval justice wasn't blind. It was drunk, angry, and holding a sword. War back then wasn't glorious. It was meat grinder chaos. Between the 100 Years' War, countless civil wars and crusades, Europe was in a constant state of armed misery. Armor was the Ferrari of the Middle Ages, sleek, expensive, and completely out of reach for peasants. A full suit of plate armor cost years of wages for a craftsman. Most soldiers wore padded cloth or bits of rusty mail if they were lucky. Weapons were crude but effective. Swords were rare, spears, axes, and farm tools were common. The longbow was the real terror. An English archer could send an arrow through a knight's armor from 100 yards away. Archers trained since childhood, developing twisted spines and calloused fingers. Battles were massacres. The Battle of Toten in 1461 killed an estimated 28,000 men in one day. That's about 1% of England's population. Some froze to death in the snow before even seeing combat. And war didn't just kill soldiers, it ruined everyone else's life. Armies lived off the land, which meant raiding farms, stealing food, and burning what they couldn't carry. Civilians were left starving, their homes in ashes. Sieges were even worse. Being trapped inside a walled city for months meant eating rats, dogs, even leather belts. During the siege of Paris in the 9th century, desperate citizens reportedly turned to cannibalism. The longest siege in history, Candia in Crete, dragged on for 21 years. That's not war, that's purgatory. Disease usually finished what the swords started. Poor sanitation in camps meant dysentery, typhus, and plague ran rampant. Medieval medics had two treatments: wash it with wine and say your prayers. So if battle didn't kill you, starvation or infection would. No medals, no glory, just another name lost to history. If you somehow survived war, famine, and disease, congratulations, now you get to live in a medieval town. Hope you brought a strong nose. Cities stank like open grave. Streets overflowed with garbage, manure, and animal carcasses. The river was a swirling soup of waste, blood, and dead fish. The smell was so infamous travelers wrote about it centuries later. People carried small bags of herbs, pomanders, just to mask the stench. Imagine living in a world where your version of deodorant is lavender stuffed in a pouch under your nose. Bathing was rare. Many believed washing too often weakened the body or invited illness. Most people bathed only once or twice a year, if that. Winter baths, forget it. You'd sooner chip ice than take a dip. Head lice were practically fashion accessories. Special combs were sold just to scrape them off. Clothes were rarely washed and made from rough wool that scratched constantly. Even nobles owned only a few outfits, and they didn't smell great either. Shoes were thin leather, no cushioning, no insulation. Walking through a medieval street was like stepping through a swamp of filth. Language was another hurdle. English in the 1400s sounded so different it might as well have been another tongue. You struggled to order a drink and they'd think you were possessed. Privacy was non-existent. Families slept 8 and worked in a single room. Strangers might share your bed at an inn, a medieval aeobn without the b. Even royalty had servants constantly hovering nearby, so personal space was a luxury no one had. Entertainment? Well, unless you count bear-baiting, public executions, or drunken storytelling at the tavern, your options were limited. Traveling musicians, jugglers, and miracle plays offered some joy, but mostly life was work, eat, sleep, repeat. And don't even dream of climbing the social ladder. Feudal society was a rigid pyramid. You were born a peasant, lived a peasant, died a peasant. Nobles ruled, clergy preached, and everyone else just tried not to starve. Superstition filled the knowledge gap. People feared witches, omens, and demons. A solar eclipse could send an entire village into hysteria. Science existed mostly as rumor. Communication was painfully slow. News traveled by word of mouth or horseback, meaning something that happened 50 miles away could take a week to reach you. Global updates, maybe next century. So after a long day of eating fungus bread, dodging chamber pots, bleeding for medicine, and hoping not to get burned as a witch, you collapse into a straw mattress crawling with fleas, and thank whatever gods you believe in that you were born in the 21st century. Modern life has its annoyances, but compared to the medieval nightmare, it's paradise. We have clean water, safe food, actual doctors, and the right not to be dunked in a river to prove our innocence. Next time your phone dies or traffic makes you late, remember. At least you're not trudging through a mud-caked street while someone above yells, "Look out below," because honestly, you wouldn't last a single day in the Middle Ages.